In this video, we'll look at the Bayes theorem calculations for posterior probabilities. If you don't have your worksheet set up like this, pause the video now and lay your worksheet out like this. Don't worry about the subscripts for the I and the subscripts for the 1 or 2. Just write in 1, 2, or I. We'll talk about how to make subscripts and superscripts in Excel during class. For now, go ahead and lay your worksheet out like this. All right, posterior probabilities allow us to know some things about our parts and our inventory in the example provided in the text. Unlike probability trees, where we know we're receiving a shipment from a particular supplier, and we know then the probability that within that shipment there will be good parts and bad parts. With posterior probabilities, we're in the middle of the production process and we come across a bad part. And we want to know, given that I'm holding a bad part, what's the probability that the bad part came from one of the suppliers, one of the 2 suppliers? So we'll use posterior probabilities to make that calculation. Now, as in the previous video, we use the same information that were provided for companies A1 and A2. Company A1, we get 65% of our parts from them, meaning that we get 35% of our parts from company A2. The probability of a bad part, given that the part comes from company A1, is 2%. The probability of a bad part, given that the part comes from company A2, is 5%. The joint probability we solved in the decision tree is simply the probability of a part from supplier A1 times the probability of a bad part, given that it's from supplier A1. So we'll do that like we did in the decision tree. We'll take 0.65 and multiply that times the conditional probability to find the joint probability. Take the prior probability and multiply that times the conditional probability to find the joint probability. So we're going to sum the joint probabilities at this point. The probability of a bad part from supplier A1 plus probability of a bad part from supplier A2 gives us the probability of a bad part from all of our suppliers, 0.0305. So just over 3%. Now the posterior probability then, to determine the probability that it came from either one of our suppliers, given that it's a bad part, is the joint probability for that supplier over the probability of a bad part. I'll just go ahead and do that calculation twice. Again, for company A2, it's the joint probability over the probability of a bad part. This gives us our posterior probabilities. So we can look at this and we can tell which of the 2 suppliers for this part tend to provide more bad parts. 57% of our bad parts come from supplier A2. That makes sense, but this allows us to identify that specifically. Now, if we had 3 or 4 or 5 suppliers, same process. We're going to add up our column to come up with the probability of bad parts, and then we'll assign the posterior probability for each of the suppliers. And then if we wanted to know the probability of a bad part from any combination of our suppliers, we would simply add these numbers together. This is the tabular approach to calculate posterior probabilities using Bayes' theorem.